Welcome back to Privacy is Power, tips and tricks for data security compliance. I'm Caroline.
And I'm Stacy.
And today we're going to use a panel to discuss labor and employment and data privacy considerations as you bring your employees back to work. Joining us today as a guest speaker is Cody Brookhauser-Sisney, a member of McGrath North's labor and employment team. Cody is going to give us her insight on labor and employment considerations as you bring your employees back to work. And as always, Stacy will provide her data privacy insights and considerations. So let's kick this off with one of the biggest questions employers have on their minds as they bring employees back to work. Cody, can employers require employees to get the vaccine?
Yes, so employers can generally require their employees to get the COVID-19 vaccine. We're helping a lot of employers right now navigate how to bring employees back to work through implementing a return to work policy or communication that certainly can include a mandatory vaccination requirement. The only thing with that is that, like with any employment policy, we have to make sure to provide or allow for reasonable accommodations for employees who cannot get the vaccine due to a disability-related reason or a religious reason.
Okay. So, Stacy, knowing what Cody said about being able to require vaccines with some of the caveats that she mentioned, what are some of the data privacy considerations if employers are actually collecting, storing, or even disclosing the vaccine information that they get from employees?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question, Caroline. It's important for employers to know that they should be providing a proper notice to their employees with respect to what information is collected, used, shared, disclosed, or retained by the organization. It's important that you update your privacy policy and that you update your data map so that you know what information is collected and how you're using it. It's also important to take into considerations on who has access to this vaccine data. It should be limited to those that it's absolutely necessary to access it, and it should be stored properly and consistent with other sensitive information. For example, under U.S. state breach notification laws, this vaccine data combined with an employee's name would be personal information that's subject to these breach notification rules if there's ever a data incident. So it should be treated similar to certain social securities, driver's license, or financial information that your organization collects, and implement the same policies and procedures with respect to it. It's also important to understand what jurisdiction your employees are in. Jurisdictions are going to govern what privacy and security rules apply. For example, if you have international employees and rules like EU's General Data Protection Regulations apply, then it's important to understand whether just a notice to these employees on the vaccine data that's collected is good enough, or if you have to get proper consent from employees. So it's important to understand what rules and policies apply and to implement them properly throughout your organization.
And another thing to consider on this is whether employers can actually require employees to show proof of vaccination. So a lot of states right now are banning what are called vaccine passports, and that actually prohibits citizens from having to show that they have been vaccinated in order to gain entry to some type of entity or establishment. There is some debate over whether this prohibition would apply to the employment relationship, but assuming that employers can require employees to show proof of vaccination, they just need to make sure when they're requesting that proof that they don't elicit any genetic or medical information, because that would implicate some ADA and GINA privacy concerns.
Cody, I'm glad you brought up some of the HR considerations. I often get questions from HR departments and benefits departments regarding whether HIPAA actually applies to any of this data. Oftentimes, employers and HR departments hear the word vaccine or they hear COVID-19 and their minds automatically go to health data. Oh my gosh, HIPAA's triggered. Well, it's important to remember that HIPAA actually only applies when there is what's called a covered entity involved. A covered entity is a group health plan, a healthcare provider, or a healthcare clearinghouse. So that means unless the vaccine is somehow related to or offered through the employer's group health plan, or potentially the employer is seeking vaccine or COVID-19 information directly from the employee's healthcare provider, HIPAA is probably not implicated. This kind of highlights the importance that Stacy and I always talk about of understanding the type of data that you're dealing with, who it's coming from, who you're giving it to, and how you're storing it, so you can understand not only the data privacy laws that apply, but also even the employment laws that might apply. So we talked about vaccine information. Let's move on to a new topic, What about COVID-19 screening questions? I know a lot of employers are asking employees a number of screening questions as they come back into the building. Are there any different employment or data privacy considerations when it comes to those screening questions?
Yeah, so COVID-19 screening questions are generally a disability-related inquiry under the ADA. So those types of inquiries have to be job-related and consistent with business necessity. But since we're in a pandemic, generally employers can certainly ask those COVID-19 screening questions as long as it's done in accordance with CDC guidance and guidance from other public health authorities. The other thing on that is that if employers are requesting or requiring the COVID-19 screening questions, that information is a disability-related inquiry, like I mentioned, so that information must be kept confidential, separate from any personnel or employment information.
Yeah, and that's absolutely right, Cody. With respect to data privacy concerns, all of the same data privacy concerns would apply to the screening question and the data collected when asking those questions. And so employers should consider what information they're collecting, whether it's personal information or just subject to some of the employment rules, who they're sharing it with, how they're using it, and then obviously keeping it confidential and proper storage, all consistent with the employer's policies and procedures that have been implemented throughout the organization.
Okay, great. So what about temperature scans? It's my understanding some employers are using temperature scans on a voluntary basis as employees come back into the building, whereas other employers are even requiring temperature scans as they come back. Are temperature scans allowed to be required or mandatory? And regardless of whether they're mandatory, what are some of the privacy considerations as well for collecting or storing that data?
Yeah, so with the temperature scans, very similar to the screening questions from an employment perspective. So they are a medical examination under the ADA, which means that that information has to, again, be kept confidential, separate from any other employment information or anything like that. But it is permissible to make them mandatory because, again, we are in a pandemic. The other thing that I will mention with regard to the temperature scans and also with the COVID-19 screening questions is that some states are actually implementing recommendations or requirements that employers implement or conduct a scan or a temperature check prior to coming into the building. So it's just important for employers to know, where they're doing business and to make sure that they are complying if they are doing business in that state.
Yeah. From a data privacy perspective, it's important for employers to really think through whether they want to actually retain that information. Is it just a check where they then allow the employees to come in the building if they pass the check? Or is it information that they're actually going to retain? That may affect what different policies they apply to it, and from a data privacy perspective, whether or not certain rules apply. For example, if they're going to use different types of temperature check devices that may have thermal imaging or infrared and collect things other than just the temperature itself, but maybe facial recognition or other data that may be considered biometric data under state laws, it's important to understand whether they're going to retain that information. They could become subject to various U.S., state, or federal international laws that regulate biometric data and the collection of it. Some of these laws don't just allow for notice to employees of the collection, but may require consent. So it may change the different procedures that are in place based off the type of data that's collected. So it's important to understand what mechanism you're using to collect the temperature and what information is actually being collected.
So we know about COVID-19 screening. Now we've talked about temperature checks. One other thing that employers are using is workplace monitoring apps to actually track COVID-19 symptoms or even vaccine status, maybe other COVID-19 related data. What, from an employment and data privacy perspective, should employers be thinking about if they want to use those workplace monitoring apps?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, and there's a lot of really new creative technologies out there that help employers track this information. Employers should remember that the collection of this information needs to be subject to their policies and procedures that are in place, and employees need to receive proper notifications with respect to it. We've seen tracking apps not just with respect to the screening questions or vaccine data, but also tracking apps that are used on employees' devices themselves and help track employees as they move throughout an organization to ensure social distancing is occurring. These types of data collection apps need to be monitored by the employer, and you need to ensure that you have a service agreement in place that regulates what the application provider can do with respect to this data and limits it. Proper notices have to be given to employees, and you should properly disclose all ways that this data is going to be used, stored, shared, and disclosed to third parties, including the application provider themselves.
Yeah, and so from my perspective, vaccine tracking is very helpful for employers because it allows them to determine what policies to implement as they are bringing employees back to the workplace. So, for example, a lot of employers right now are kind of struggling with and deciding what to do with mask requirements in the workplace. So, if they are tracking which employees have been vaccinated and which haven't, they're able to better make that determination as to whether or not to lift that mandate. So, it can be super helpful to track which employees have been vaccinated.
Cody and Stacy, thank you so much for your time today. This discussion has been really helpful. Cody, thanks for being a guest speaker
Thank
on
you.
Privacy is Power today. Remember that McGrath North's privacy and cybersecurity team, as well as McGrath North's labor and employment team, is here to help. We can answer any questions you might have as you're bringing your employees back to work. Thanks for watching Privacy is Power. We'll see you next month.